Hello race fans, it is Sunday, October 25th, and I'm here to talk to you about the last cross-country meet, which was actually on the 20th, Tuesday, Preston's cross-country and Colleen's cross-country meet. It was back in Owatonna, which is where the race was 2 weeks ago. The last video I had was from Owatonna. This race was the Big Nine Championship, so it's like the, I think I mentioned in my last video, it's like the Black Hills League. So that's their championship for their high school league. And then the meet that's coming up this Thursday is the sections. So it goes from that Big Nine to sections, and then the sections meet is where you're going to have a lot more schools. It's going to be a much bigger race. The competition is going to be much fiercer. So you have several leagues all coming together. And again, that race is at Owatonna. And I'll talk more about that next week. So this meet was back in Owatonna again, and you know, Preston's had a couple of really good races there, as did everybody else. But it was an exciting race because the previous race, you know, things were really, really tight. The finish was really tight. There were, I think you remember when I had all the little doodadery on the table, there were 4 or 5 people all within like a second and a half of each other. So I was fairly certain Preston was going to be on varsity, but not really sure exactly how that was going to play out. So there was actually an interesting thing. I was talking to one of the parents who was asking me why the varsity lineup was the way it was, and I didn't know. But he said that typically it's always the top 7 from the previous race, regardless of whether, you know, top 7 in time, whether some of those are running a varsity. And, you know, I've talked about this again and again. But that wasn't the case at this race on Tuesday. So in the ranking of finishing, you had Preston, you had Carter, you had Colton Brand next, and then you had Yusuf like 10 or 12 seconds behind. Now Yusuf had a bad race, admittedly, but if you go with that logic of the top 7 always go on, then somebody like Yusuf, who might have one bad race, is not going to end up running varsity. Well, what the coach ended up doing was he actually ended up putting Yusuf on varsity and Colton on varsity, and of course Preston, which left Carter Briggs. Now Carter, of that group, is the only one who's not in high school. Now I don't know whether that had anything to do with it or not, but he put all of those anyway. So that's who was running the varsity race. So it was you know, the regular guys who were always at the top, and then it was Yusuf and Preston and Colton rounding out 5, 6, and 7 runners, and then Carter Briggs was running the varsity race. So it was going to be a tough race because the air temperature was 78, and you know, that doesn't sound very warm, but you know, runners, especially Preston and Colleen, don't like the warmer weather. So anyway, Colleen was again running junior varsity, which, you know, was to be expected. So the girls' race is first. So let's watch some video from it.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Yeah. So one day I decide to leave my home.
Way to go.
All right, Kaya, all right, Colleen.
Way to go, guys. Way to go.
Way to go, Kaya. Way to go, Colleen. I have found that if I cheer and film, then I get disgrace. Yes. Kaya. Colleen.
Oh, Anna. Come on, Anna. You
Go,
got
Brenna.
it, Anna. Let's go, Anna. Yeah, Katie. Go.
All right, Kaya, all right, Colleen.
Go, Colleen.
Yeah, Anna. Go, Anna. Woo. Go, Anna.
Kaya.
All right, Colleen.
Way to go, Colleen.
Okay, so Colleen had a pretty good race. You could see that she was a little bit behind Kaya, but she finished actually in front of Brenna, who was the person who she wanted to catch in this race. So interestingly, her time, she ended up getting a 23:51, not a PR. Kaya had a 23:39, so she was about 12 seconds in front of Colleen, also not a PR. But again, all the times were slower on this race because it was just a warmer day. As a matter of perspective, the number one Winona runner got a 20:11. So, that's about where Colleen's been finishing. Now, there were 3 DNFs from the Winona team that did not finish. Normally, these were girls who would have finished in front of Colleen. But interestingly, Colleen finished 8th overall in time, which was pretty darn cool for her, given where she started at the start of the season. Now, again, factor in those 3 DNFs, and she would have been 11th. But still, I'm really proud of the fact that she's running, ever faster, and yeah, it was cool. She was really happy about her race, and I was thrilled for her too. So yeah, so that's Colleen's race. So now let's look at the boys' varsity race.
Come on, Central! Nice job, Lisa. Nice job, John. Nice job, Red Wing. Go Forest. Go Brian.
Good. That's the number 1 kid last year. Nice job, Century.
All right, Noah.
Okay, Clay.
All right, Winona. All right, Preston, keep up. All right, Winona. Push it, Preston, push it.
No. Come on, Zeke. Come on, board. 104 race.
All right, Carter. All right, Noah. All right, Cassidy.
Come on, Isaac. Keep it up. Keep it up. Stay with this Red Wing guy. Come on, Isaac. Get open, though.
All right, Yusuf. All right, Preston, close the gap. Catch Yusuf.
Come on, Joe.
All right, Yusuf.
Mitch, move with the group.
Keep it up, East. Keep going.
Mitch, move with the group.
Let's go, Ken. All right, Preston, time to pick it up. All right, Yusuf.
It seems like we would have seen.
I'm watching for green and blue.
Well, if you ran by, you'd think they would have known.
All right, Preston. Kick it in.
Okay, I don't know if you could tell from the race, but Preston did not have a good race. He struggled the whole time, and you could probably see in each of the subsequent videos he was dropping a little farther behind, a little farther behind. It was a slow race for everybody, but proportionately very slow for Preston. He ended up finishing 7th on the varsity team behind Colton Brand. So the rank of finishes were Kale with a 17:22. He was first on the Winona team. Then Cassidy with a 17:25. Carter Fritz with a 17:38. Noah Schultz with a 17:44. That was a minute slower than last week. Carter Briggs, oh wait a minute, hold on. So he was junior varsity. Colton had an 18:07. Yusuf had an 18:12. And then Preston had an 18:29, which was about a minute slower for him last week as well. So really bad race for him, and you could probably tell in the backstretch he had nothing left. He just he wasn't sure if he just didn't feel well. Physically, he said he felt fine. I think he thought maybe he psyched himself out a little bit, a little race stress, and he just wasn't able to run relaxed. Which will get you every time. So the next race after that one was the junior varsity race. So Carter Briggs was running that race. Also, interestingly, Alex, a boy named Alex Rudnick. Alex is a freshman as well. He's also one of the top runners. He's usually in the top 2 or 3 on varsity, but he's got a breathing condition, sort of an asthma related thing, but it's exacerbated by stress. So when he gets out under the race stress, he ends up having a breathing issue to the point where literally his airway will snap shut. And they've had to call the ambulance on several occasions, 3 occasions for him this year. He's not run the last 4 races because of that. But he hasn't run a full race since the time trial, which is the very first thing they did. That was like an intra-squad race. So this is actually his first race. So Carter Briggs and Alex Rudnick were both running junior varsity. And I don't have any video of that, but Carter Briggs had a great race. He ended up running in 17:54. And Alex Rudnick ended up running in 18:12. So overall, in the overall rankings 1 through 9, Preston ended up as 9th on the day. Carter Briggs ended up 5th overall time. So it's interesting, that choice of not putting Carter Briggs on the varsity race and instead of putting Colton, because he ended up beating Colton by 13 seconds. So anyway, this brings up an interesting situation because again, so Yusuf had a bad race last week or the week before, and he still ran varsity this week. So what did the coaches now do with Preston? Now granted, I'm sharing this just with you guys. It's not something I'm talking to the coach about, because they're the coaches, they can figure it out. But Preston was really, really upset about the race, and one of those where when I went over to talk to him after the race, I just left him alone. Sometimes you just need to do that. So, but I talked to him on the way home, and I asked him what was more upsetting. Was it the fact that he wasn't on, that he had a bad race, a slow time, or that he felt like because of the bad race and slow time, he was going to end up being on JV the next week? And for him, it was more the JV. I think it's easy to shake off a bad race, but if that means you have to run JV the next week, and it's just, I think he feels special being on varsity. Of course he does, and he's having to deal with that. To his credit, after the race, he collected himself, and then he went and cheered on Carter Briggs and the other JV runners, which I thought was very mature of him. But I think one of the other things that's weighing on Preston's mind is that he's applying for the Rotary Exchange for next year, so he could not be here next year, and next week will be his last race for a full year. I think he wants to run varsity. So, but so it goes. Mighty Casey strikes out every now and again, and that's life, right? Something he has to deal with. But he's dealing with it fine. So coming into this next week, it's going to be interesting to see what the coaches do. I think I had mentioned about the spreadsheet. I was doing the averages on the spreadsheet. So when you look at the average placed finished over the whole season, Preston still sits at number 7. When you look at the average time of your race, of your average time run, and what I did is I just looked at the last 4 races because I felt that was more meaningful. Preston is still ranked 7th, even though he's ranked 9th, after last week's race. So I don't know what the coaches will do and how they'll deal with that, because one of the issues that I have with just simply taking the top 7 is, for example, Noah Schultz, who is one of the very top runners, often finishing first in the races on the Winona team. One of the issues is that, so there was one week where he didn't run at all because his asthma was acting up. So in a sense, and so the following race, he still raced on varsity. So in a sense, you're almost better off not running at all than you are running a bad race. So also, if you're a swift runner and you end up getting tripped and you go down and you finish a minute slower, does that mean you should get put on JV the next week? No, it seems silly. So I think there are some noticeable flaws with the top 7 always run varsity the next week. I don't agree with that. And I told Preston that I think probably the wisest thing for the coaches, because they've got a whole core of young boys who are going to be the core of that team next year, and Preston may or may not be a part of that, depending on how the Rotary interviews go. But I think actually for this last race, it would be beneficial to have a couple of the kids who've not been running varsity, but who will definitely be on varsity next year, run the varsity in the sections race. Primarily because the Winona team is not going to make state. So this sections race decides who goes to state. So the top 2 team finishers go to state, and Winona's probably going to be down around 6 or 7 because they usually are. And then it's the top 10 runners, the top 10 finishers also go to state. But what they do is if you are a top 10 finisher but your team is going to state, they pull you out of that top 10. So it's the top 10 runners of teams that aren't going to state. Does that make sense? So there's really only maybe one of the Winona runners, Noah maybe Kale if he has an awesome race, who might get to go to state. But for the most part, when you're dealing with, the 6, 7, 8, 9 runners, it's really more a matter, I think, of giving some of those younger kids experience of running with the bigger kids. Some of those guys are men out there. You know what I mean? So anyway, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen for this race. But what I do know is Carter Briggs finished 5th in the JV race last week. So I think Preston has a very real opportunity, if he's running JV, of actually winning this JV race. Maybe not winning, because there's going to be a lot more. Take that back. There's going to be a lot of other teams there that their JV runners run as fast as our varsity runners. So cancel that. Anyway, it's going to be an interesting day. It's going to be an interesting race. All Preston can do is run fast, and Colleen can run fast, and So that next race is this Thursday, which is the the 29th, I think, of October. And so I'll make sure that I shoot video, and I will post it hopefully promptly. So anyway, from Winona, all I can say is go Winhawks.